What's up, guys? And we're back for another episode of the Justin Caviar Show. My guest today is Stephen Kotler. Stephen is a New York Times bestselling author, an award-winning journalist, the executive director of the Flow Research Collective. He's one of the world's largest leading experts on human performance. He's the author of 10 bestsellers out of 13 books total, including The Art of Impossible, The Future is Faster Than You Think, Stealing Fire, The Rise of Superman, Bold and Abundance. His work is translated into 40 different languages, and he's appeared in over 100 publications, including the New York Times Magazine, Wired, Atlantic Monthly, Time, and the Harvard Business Review. Stephen is also the co-host of Flow Research Collective Radio, a top 10 iTunes science podcast. And Stephen, I would like to welcome you to the show.
Good to be with you.
All right, man. So let's get right into it. Tell people a little bit more about what you do.
So I'm an author, I'm a journalist, and I'm the executive director of the Flow Research Collective, where we're a research and training organization. We study the neurobiology of peak human performance. So what's going on in the human brain when people are performing at their absolute best. We do this in conjunction with researchers, neuroscientists at USC, Stanford, UCLA, Imperial College London, a bunch of other places. And we take what we learn and we use it to train people. And we train about 1,000 people a month, everybody from professional athletes, members of the U.S. Special Forces, through, we work with a lot of companies, C-suite executives at a lot of Fortune 500 companies, through the general public. And that could mean, insurance brokers in Delhi, or soccer moms in Indiana, or, football coaches in France, in Paris. I'm going by cities. The reason all that I think matters to anybody at all is you just watch people, lots of training, lots of data on the back end. So we know a bunch of stuff about what works on the front end for the science, and then we take it out into the real world. We train a lot of people. We gather a tremendous amount of data along the way. So we've got really good data sets on how this stuff gets applied as well. So that's what I do.
That's incredible. So that's a lot to take in, right? So I know you have a new book, The Art of Impossible, and a lot of people might know your other books, like Stealing Fire. I read Stealing Fire back in, I think it was 2016, I believe. And I saw you on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I was like, okay, I got to get into these flow states. I started doing downhill mountain biking. I started doing actually rollerblades. I almost died actually one time because I have these rollerblades, and there's a bridge here, and I'm in Tampa. And there's not too many mountains here in Florida, but we have some bridges that go over highways. So because I read your book, I jumped on my rollerblades, and there's no brakes. It's all or nothing. And I flew down the bridge. Now, I've never fell, and I still haven't to this day, knock on wood, have fell. But I did experience some flow state type sensations while I was going down. Extremely dangerous. I do not recommend this for anyone, but you were my inspiration. So thank you.
I have had personally horrific rollerblading accidents in myself. I'm not much of a rollerblader, but I had tried at some point, and I discovered what you discovered. There's no fucking brakes. What the hell do you do? I discovered that if you try to bail into a fire hydrant to slow you down, the fire hydrant will actually flip you into the street. So avoid the fire hydrant. Stop.
Don't grab anything.
Don't grab anything. And I feel really bad when people say things like, "You inspired me to take up downhill mountain biking," because 7 out of 8 years I end the downhill mountain bike season in the hospital. So okay, I tell people don't do what I do, right? Like that's not the point here. But I'm glad I had a little bit of an impact.
You did. You had a huge impact on my rollerblading career, and also
so much.
I also want to put this little caveat in there: is watch out for sticks, because if you hit a stick.
And by the way, all my skateboarder friends and all my skier friends, the entire and snowboarder, for everybody who grew up thinking that rollerblading is insert derogatory term here, they're now like, Kotler, we got to talk to you.
Oh man, there's probably a whole list of people that read your book and they're just like, let's go for it. And hopefully they didn't learn the hard way. I got lucky, but there was a couple times where I grabbed the railing. I said, "Oh, nope, quick spin," and you just got to go for it. But I think it's intriguing. So why would someone want to get into a flow state for people that haven't read your prior books?
So let's just start with what is flow what does it mean to be in flow? What's it good for? Right? Like that's simple questions. So um,
Right.
let's just start at the top with the term peak performance, actually, before we even get to flow. When I say peak performance, what the hell am I even talking about? Well, all I mean by the term peak performance is getting our biology to work
Mm.
for us rather than against us. That's all I mean by that. To put it in a different term, human beings are all hardwired for peak performance. It's a built-in benefit of being human. And there's a bunch of things going on when I say our biology. There's actually a set of skills you would file under the heading motivation, a set of skills you'd file under the head of learning, a set of skills you'd file under head of creativity, and finally a set of skills you file under the heading of flow. Flow is sort of the secret sauce because it's technically defined as optimal performance. It is a state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. It refers more specifically, and you may call it, by the way, being in the zone or runner's high or being unconscious. If you play basketball, if you're a stand-up comic, they sometimes call it the forever box. I can go on and on the lingo. The experience is always the same. In flow, we get so focused on the task at hand, so focused on what we're doing, everything else just starts to fade away and disappear. So action awareness are going to start to merge. Your sense of time is going to dilate. That's a fancy way of saying it passes strangely. Most of the time, most common experience is you get so sucked into what you're doing that 5 hours goes by in like 5 minutes. Occasionally, what you were just, I believe, referring to you in your experience on the bridge, time started to slow down. And that happens in action sports sometimes, often in a car crash, right? You'll get a freeze from effect or in your sense of self-consciousness, that'll diminish greatly. And throughout all aspects of performance, both mental and physical, go through the roof. And through the roof is not by any stretch of the imagination an exaggeration. I will come back to a little bit more about the psychological definition, but let's just talk about why this is what it's good for. And right. So these numbers, the studies have been done all over the place, and we can drill down into any of them that you want. We know that motivation, productivity, and grit can spike sometimes 500% above baseline. In studies by the U.S. Department of Defense, soldiers in flow will learn 240 to 500% faster than normal. In studies we ran at the Flow Research Collective, that were run, some of them were run at Harvard, the University of Sydney, a bunch of other places. Creativity, innovation, all aspects of creative problem solving will spike 400 to 700%. So huge shifts in meaning, purpose, well-being, overall life satisfaction. And there's a shared collective version of flow state, right? There's me and you in a flow state together. It's called group flow. This is also really common. And to facilitate group flow, we also see huge spikes in flow in collaboration, cooperation, empathy, environmental awareness. And the empathy, like, just to give you an idea, we're doing a tremendous amount of work right now with a lot of police forces all throughout America. Social justice issues are a big deal to them for obvious reasons. Empathy, how do we learn to be empathetic, is a really big deal. And there are a couple ways you can do it. You can teach people compassion-inducing meditation, which generally works, but not so well if you try to get law enforcement officers to do it. So we find that flow is a sort of, at peak performance, is a better way in for that particular training. So yeah, huge spikes, huge performance benefits. You also get strength and fast twitch muscle response and blah, blah. And by the way, one thing I'd like to point out, if you are science-minded at all and you hear somebody like me just spout off a whole, this thing is good for all this shit, and it sound right. You gotta, if you are skeptical at all, you gotta go, well, okay, what the hell? Why is one state of consciousness good for? Like, what are you talking about? So that's actually an answer worth exploring for half a second, so you don't think I'm crazy. Evolution shaped.
I can't promise that.
That's true too. Evolution shaped all of us to perform at our best, right? Flow is how we do it, and you have to ask yourself, well, what drives evolution? And scarcity of resources is the biggest driver of evolution. And if you include if mates become a resource and you include sexual selection, you've just got the whole ball game. So when you're faced with scarce resources, there are two options. You can fight over dwindling resources, or you can flee to avoid becoming somebody else's resources, or you get cooperative, get creative, get innovative, and make new resources. So why does this whole smorgasbord of stuff get optimized by flow? It's everything you could possibly need to fight or flee, or get creative, get cooperative, learn some stuff, and make new resources. That's why we think the state evolved. That's why it seems to amplify so many different kind of experiences. And finally, the one thing that's worth saying, because you alluded to part of it, and I wanted to clarify on something. So there is microflow and macroflow. So when psychologists define flow, they say, look, there are these 6 phenomenological, big fancy word that means how does the experience make me feel? Characteristics of flow. So when we're flow, there's 6 things we can look for, and I just listed a bunch of them. There's complete concentration on the task at hand. There's a merger of action awareness, time dilation, the vanishing of self. We don't react. We don't see peak performance. What we see is this feeling of control. Oh my God, I've got control over stuff I normally can't control. It's going to be me as a writer, right? Have things with language that, normally I don't do at 12:12 on a Friday afternoon. Or this could be you as a podcaster, right? Leading a conversation that is just fantastic and going right. We all have these experiences. We feel this amazing sense of control. And finally, the experience is autotelic. It's euphoric. It's an end in itself. Once an experience starts producing flow, it's so addictive. It's so fun, so meaningful. We'll go really far out of our way to get more of it. So they can show up dialed down to 1 or 2. That's microflow. This is extremely common. This is you go to work, you sit down to write a quick email to your boss, and you end up writing the Magna Carta, right? You'll look up an hour later, you're like, what happened to the time? Oh my God, I just wrote an essay. And maybe your sense of self didn't vanish completely or anything like that, but bodily awareness did. When you pop back into consciousness, you're like, oh wow, I gotta run to the bathroom, and you go pee, right? Like that happens to all of us every day. The opposite end, much closer to probably what happened to you on the bridge, is macro flow. This is often misdiagnosed, or was defined as a spiritual religious experience, meaning they only thought it was common to spiritual religious people. We started to find out that's not true in the middle of the 20th century and so forth. But like time will slow down. Not only will your sense of self disappear and the whole voice in your head will be quiet, but you can start to have out of body experiences. You'll have sensations of oneness with everything. It tends to be like whatever it is that you're focused on. So surfers will become one with the waves. Skiers will get oneness with the mountain. Musicians will get oneness with the bandmates and the music. And it depends on what you're focused on, you tend to merge with. We understand the biology underneath all this. And I could talk about it. If you want to know why this shit happens, we can talk about that. I'm happy to do it. But that's macro flow. So I'm guessing when you were on the bridge and you were rollerblading, sports and flow, but this is everybody listening to me can get into flow. It's task independent. It shows up in anyone, anywhere, provided certain initial conditions are met. So like when they did the initial research on flow, I always like to point this out to people. Yeah, they looked at expert surgeons and rock climbers and stockbrokers and, et cetera, but they also looked at like Japanese teenage motorcycle gang members and elderly Korean women in meditation circles and Detroit assembly line workers and Chicago meat packers. And if you can get into a flow state on an assembly line, in fact, I read, and I didn't know this until last week, I had no idea, there is work showing you can get into flow in a concentration camp, and the people who experience more flow inside of concentration camps and prison camps have better outcomes on the other side. And we also know, this is new from Adam Grant's work, the people who did the best during COVID and who came out the other end thriving the most and with the least kind of emotional damage, they looked at a ton of variables. They thought it was going to be optimism, secure, all that. It was the amount of flow you got during COVID was the number one indicator of how you're doing now.
Interesting. So let's break it down. Like, let's simplify it to the easiest way possible for, someone that is just listening to this, just here, they're just hearing about flow. How is someone, if you could control it, right? Maybe you can't control it. How would someone say, okay, cool, I'm going into this meeting, I want to be mentally in a flow state?
So it is not a light switch.
Okay.
It's not a binary. It's a 4-stage process, first of all. And you have to move the brain through each stage of the cycle to do that. So that's worth knowing. That said, can we make the experience extremely reliable and repeatable and all that stuff? Yes, absolutely. And we measure flow pre and post. Everybody we train at the Flow Research Collective, and we on average will get, using the standard psychological instrument, we didn't make anything up, we're just using what everybody else uses, and we see a 70 to 80% increase in flow on average. Now, a couple things are worth knowing. Unless you've also trained up a bunch of other skills. That huge acceleration is not sustainable. So there's other stuff you need besides just flow. But how do you do that? Like what's going on there? That's what we can talk about. And that's what's useful to your listeners is flow states have triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. You want more flow in your life. These triggers are your toolkit. There are 22 that have been discovered. There are probably way, way more, but that's what we know so far. And there are 12 individual triggers will drive me into flow or you into flow. And there's 10 group triggers. If we're using them together, they'll drive us into a flow state. So all the triggers essentially work the same way. Flow follows focus. It only shows up when all of our attention is in the right here, right now. So that's what the triggers do. They drive our attention to the present moment. Now, if I were to put it formally, scientifically, I would say they do this one of three ways. They can either produce the neurochemical dopamine. Dopamine heightens focus and excitement and wins their attention. In our system, we pay attention to the thing that's in front of us. Heighten norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is roughly the same thing. A little bit is curiosity and excitement. If I crank the knob way up, you get anxiety and overwhelm. But it's essentially the excitement. Oh, cool. What's this? I want to pay attention, right? Spectrum as well. Or the triggers will lower cognitive load. Cognitive load is all the crap you're trying to think about at any one time. And the brain is very, very efficient. And so if I lower cognitive load, I liberate some energy, right? There's less stuff you have to pay attention to. And the brain says, oh, we can take this energy and repurpose it for paying attention to the thing that you're trying to pay attention to. That's how the triggers work. Sometimes they do one of those things. Sometimes it's two. Sometimes it's three. So what are some really like the obvious examples? Like you've got to start at the beginning. Flow follows focus. It demands complete concentration. Complete concentration is a flow trigger. So, okay, that's nice. Well, what does that actually mean, right? So when we work with clients, we tell them you want to start your work session and you should start your work session. And I use work session instead of saying day. For most people, it's going to be start your day. But you want your hardest work period in your life, if you can, if you have any control of your schedule, to be in accordance with your circadian rhythms. We can't fight our own biology. My wife is a night owl. Nothing in the world is going to really wake her brain up until like 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night. I am an extreme lark. I'm the exact opposite. I am wide awake at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. That's when I start my day. And my wife, like she comes to talk to me when she's waking up, I'm going to bed. I'm going to kill her, right? Stay away from me. I don't want to work then. So you got to work in accordance with your circadian rhythms, but you start your workday with a period, the research shows, of 90 to 120 minutes of uninterrupted concentration. Now, why 90 to 120 minutes? Because our brains are actually designed to focus for that block of time. And this shouldn't be surprising. We have REM cycles, right? We all know about REM sleep. We all know it's about 90 to 110 minutes long. This is when we dream. That's a dreaming. We have similarly a waking focus cycle that is also roughly 90 to 120 minutes long. It's the same thing, just while we're awake, different kind of thing. And so we tell people, start your day with your hardest task, meaning the thing that will, if you finish it, is the biggest win. And if you can, spend 90 to 120 minutes on it. Now, I'm a little hardcore about this. When we work with organizations and we work with big fancy organizations, I always walk in. Well, I don't walk in because I don't train anybody. That's a disaster. But the people I work with walk in and they always say the same thing now, which is, if you can't hang a sign on your office door that says "fuck off, I'm flowing," you can't do this work, right? That's really. Now, I'm not. By the way, there are certain people, myself as well. I wrote my thesis in college in a bar. I was a bartender. I lived very far from campus, so I would work in the bar. I was, before my shift started, and I'm great at turning out enormous amounts of noise and being able to run stuff like that. So some people can focus really well in a coffee shop, et cetera, et cetera. So really concentration is the obvious one. There's a bunch of triggers, and you were talking about rollerblading. Why action sports? Like why? Well, because risk is a flow trigger. It drives our attention, right? When we take a risk, we get dopamine, which is essentially, it's the OG liquid courage, right? Before there was booze, there was dopamine. And what does, by the way, booze release? Dopamine. So dopamine is essentially liquid courage, and you can get it from risk, but that could be physical risk, could be social risk, intellectual risk, creative risk. All of them still produce the same amounts of dopamine. Unpredictability, complexity, novelty, will also produce dopamine. So I'll give you an example of how some of this stuff works in my life. I have to do my job, obviously, I got to read a bunch of neuroscience textbooks. And as you could imagine, they're the most thrilling, exciting, fascinating books you've ever read in your entire life. And you certainly don't want to read them twice, right? You want to read them carefully. You want to do it. So I really want to be in flow because it amplifies learning, like 240 to 500% above normal. One of the flow trigger I should mention for this story to make total sense is that pattern recognition is another flow trigger. So when we link ideas together, we've all had this experience. If you've ever done a crossword puzzle that played Sudoku and you get an answer right, that little rush of pleasure you feel, that's dopamine. And one of the cool things about dopamine is again, why do creative ideas spiral? Why does one lead to the next, lead to the next? It's because dopamine, not only is it produced by pattern recognition, it amplifies pattern recognition. So it's in our system, we notice more connections between ideas. If you've done crossword puzzles, you'll notice you rarely just get one answer right. You get 2 or 3 in a row. That's dopamine helping you find more patterns. It's got a short shelf life, so it wears off a little bit, right?
Right.
But it works. It works. That's what's going on. So all that said, when I have to read a bunch of neuroscience textbooks, and I just did this 2 weeks ago because I'm working on a new project, and I was like, oh crap, I've got 5 textbooks I've got to read to take this the next step. So I went up. It was the last week at Mammoth, the ski area. I live in Tahoe. Yep. So I went to Mammoth, and I took a hotel room with a huge view of the mountain. And I skied in the morning, and in the afternoon, I sat on my porch and I looked out at the mountain, which was a novel, unpredictable environment. So the novelty of the environment put some dopamine in my system. The unpredictability of the environment, right, put some more dopamine in my system. And I'm going to start reading my neuro textbooks. All that has to happen now is because I'm a little primed. So I'm noticing a few more patterns while I'm reading the textbooks. So suddenly, like page 6, there's a neat idea that I've never seen before. And because I've got more dopamine in my system already, it's going to connect to this older idea that I've already had. And now I'm going to start that loop. And 10 to 15 pages in, I'm dropping into a low-grade microflow state. And suddenly, retention is up, my learning is up, and so is enjoyment. So suddenly, reading a difficult neuro textbook that would normally make me crazy if I tried to read it here in my office, unless it's like 4 o'clock in the morning and dead silent and everybody, you know what I mean?
Right.
It becomes really easy, and suddenly I can do something like go skiing all morning and read 5 neuroscience textbooks over the course of a week in the afternoons. It's a tremendous amount of like neuro reading, but flow makes it possible. And so that's just a like simple technique I use all the time in my own life. Or you same thing, go to a coffee shop in a part of the city you don't normally go to, right? Same kind of thing. So there's a bunch more flow triggers and a bunch of stuff like that.
So basically the artist surprise at that point.
Surprise will work because it's novelty.
Yeah. So that's so interesting, right? Because all my biohacking friends, they'll go out, they'll do downhill rollerblading, downhill skiing, and they'll actually do it every morning if it could get them in a flow state, and then do their work or elevate their business afterwards.
Yeah, if you go into that's
for the extreme people.
It's not extreme at all. I think it's like it depends on where you live. You see it in the biohacking community, Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is where I used to live. It was like this. There's the Santa Fe ski area is right above town. Almost half the town every morning drives up to the ski area. Before it even opens, they hike up the mountain and ski down once. This is like, I mean, there's a line of people,
Wow.
hundreds of people long. This is not just for like hardcore. Yeah, this is a lot of people play this way. Stone patrol and surfing is another one of these.
Surfing, yeah. What would you say to someone that lives in a city and they don't have access to that? And
you're fixated on action sports because you had a rollerblading experience. You got a bunch of biohacking friends who are into that. I start every day writing books, so I have a very specific flow protocol, editing protocol. I will do the same thing. I don't want to face an empty page. I want to be in flow by the time so I always start by editing the stuff I wrote the day before, because editing is essentially low-grade pattern recognition. So, right, you're not starting from scratch. You're just tweaking and fixing little patterns. And so if I edit what I wrote the day before, one, you're getting dopamine from fixing the patterns. And two, when you clean it up again, which doesn't take as long as writing it from scratch, you get more dopamine from a job well done, right? This is goal setting and goals and clear goals and executing on clear goals. Clear goals are another flow trigger, right? Some of them have nothing to do with dopamine. Clear goals are like a daily to-do list because it exports cognitive load. So I tell people to make your daily to-do list the night before. So when you wake in, if you think about it, what a to-do list is, it tells your brain, focus on this and focus on this next, right? Put all your attention here. This is the clear goals is the term also. So they're very clearly defined. Like for me, a writing clear goal is write 700 words in the new book. And when you're done, make sure when your readers read them, they feel joy or excitement or curiosity or terror, whatever it is that I'm trying to, convey to my reader at that particular moment. That's another flow hack. And what we usually see people who are good at this, organizations, individuals, action sport athletes, is they tend to build their lives around flow triggers, right? You can sort of bolt flow on to any process. It's easier if you start with flow at the center and say, hey, the goal is actually to produce as much flow as possible, and work outward from there. That tends to be more effective. A lot of organizations can't do that. Certain organizations, like companies like Patagonia, Microsoft, Toyota, these companies have management philosophies with like flow at the heart of what they do. So some organizations have an easier time.
That's interesting. How much does genetics play a role in this?
So it's a great question. And the answer is, the truth is, we don't know. We know that there is some correlation between several of the dopamine receptors and flow proneness, obviously, but there are a bunch of flow triggers that have nothing to do with dopamine, right? They don't, like, dopamine is required for it, but you don't, like some people, for example, my wife hates risk, right? Altruism is her thing. And there's an altruism triggered flow state known as helper's high. And it's a very deep, powerful flow state that comes from helping others, like the exact opposite of a risk profile, right? And that may be a little more endorphin or oxytocin heavy flow state and may not need as much dopamine on the front end. So there are whole, groups of people who come in differently. So which triggers, we know the triggers work for everybody because they're biological, meaning like if you take a risk, you're going to get dopamine. Right. But your risk tolerance is my risk tolerance, is my wife's risk tolerance, is Sarah's down the street. They're all going to be very different. Those are established by nature and nurture. And that's very individual. That's why. So one of the things I always like to say, this is a mantra at the Flow Research Collective, which is biology scales, personality doesn't scale. And what we mean by that is very often in the peak performance world, in the coaching world, and definitely in the self-help world, somebody will figure out, oh, this works for me. Let me teach it to other people. And they're absolutely convinced it's going to work for everybody else. And as a general rule, it's a disaster. Like you can fuck lives up, pardon my language, really badly. And the reason is, I always tell people, the pre-guaranteed that what works for me isn't going to work for you, right? You have to be wired a very specific way and the reason is, that's why we like to take things down to foundational neurobiological principles, because you got to get below the squishy subjective layer of personality, because those big 5 personality traits are, whether or not they're mutable, that's an open question that scientists love arguing over. I would say yes, but over long periods of time. But either way, like, your risk tolerances are pretty much established before you're 12 years old. And if you want to change them, it's going to take about a decade of work. That's what we know. Like, you can work at it. You can do the same thing with openness to experience. Openness to experience is a really kind of foundationally hardwired trait. It correlates to all kinds of great stuff, from life satisfaction to creativity, but it's hardwired. And if you want to change it, you can, but it just takes, you work at it daily for 5-10 years. That's how you change something like that. So if I'm really, really open to experience and I've got really high risk tolerances, both of which are true, and somebody else doesn't, right? Like, what works for me, if I try to, it's going to be disaster. I'll give you another one. I'm an extreme introvert. So there's a whole bunch of people out there who are extroverts, and they think flow is always group flow and they need other people around. And so I ski with one of my dear friends who I ski with, always have to remind him, like, okay, there's a rule. When you ski with Steven, you ski with Steven. You don't invite 10 of your other friends along for the ride. But that's how he likes to ski. He's a group flow
Right.
guy, so he wants 10 people around him. And I'm like, I hate that. Like, that makes me absolutely crazy. In fact, if you ever see me in ski gear, like, I love COVID because I wore a full helmet, full face mask. You couldn't see me.
You wore a full
Goggles.
astronaut suit.
I swear to God, you couldn't get near me. Like, the photos are funny as hell. But there's like no photos of me this past year wearing anything but like a full face black helmet. I look like
God,
Darth
it's
Vader.
hilarious.
It's hilarious.
That sounds pretty cool. You walking around like a stormtrooper. It's not that bad.
That's what I'm saying.
So I want to ask you, because you talked about, genetics and about being 12 and it takes a decade to overcome that. What kind of person was Steven growing up? Like, how did you get into the space you're at now? I'm curious, like 12-year-old Steven, if we went to the same elementary school, what type of kid were you? And how did you evolve into this now?
So I'm an old school punk rocker. I mean, you gotta, like, that's what you're looking at. You're looking at a punk rocker from Cleveland, Ohio. And like a true punk rock weirdo. I was a super nerd at 12. I was into action sports, which was not like, you got to remember, this is the like 70s, and action sports are not like, they're not sports, right? Like, this is deep subculture. I was a skateboarder, and you know what I mean? Like, nobody had a skateboard in Ohio. I was probably the first skateboard in like 30 square miles. I was into dinosaurs and Dungeons and Dragons, and I was that, and martial arts, and I mean, we were hell. I was a really, really crazy kid. Dang, I was the kid that other parents warned their kids about. I was
Steven, that guy down the street. Don't fucking hang out with that guy.
I was that guy. I scared other parents. Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah.
It's part of the game. It's part about growing up, going to public school.
Yeah, especially in Ohio.
Oh, man. So how did you migrate into punk rock Steven into now some people view you, they look to you as, the main source of science?
Yeah. So there were, obviously this doesn't happen overnight, right? But the real big inflection point started in my early 20s. I came out of grad school. I was a writer, and I wanted to write books, and nobody pays you to write books. I had to get a job of some kind, and I had long dreadlocks and earrings, and
Oh wow, you look like the lead singer of Korn.
I did look a little long before he was the lead singer of Korn. He looks like me more than I look like him, but okay. Yeah. So nobody would hire me, right? And but magazine journalism was like the freaking wild west, right? Like punks had been putting out zines since the 70s, so we had experience here. And then suddenly there's like digital publishing apps. So suddenly anybody can put out glossy magazines, and there's an explosion, right? So magazines are like the internet before the internet, and if you can write, there's work, and you get to be paid to explore and learn about whatever you're really super interested in. And I was interested in a couple things. I've always been a science geek, as I said, and I was really fascinated by how do humans work. Right? Like, how do we work? And I liked neuroscience, and neuroscience in the 90s, when this was going on, is this amazing, crazy time where for the very first time, people don't know this because we've gotten so far so fast, but emotions were not a real topic in science until the 1990s, because that was the first time we mapped, like, neuron by neuron. This is where like fear comes from, and joy. And we know that, all mammals have these 7 foundational emotions, and like that stuff was unknown before then. So for the very first time, we were like, oh my God, behavior. This is how behavior works. And if you're interested, like if you're me and you're wired for like, I want it to be reliable and practical, and I want to use it, right?
Yes.
Psychology, useful, super useful, but it's ultimately subjective. Psychology is metaphor. Neuroscience is mechanism. And if your interest is reliable and repeatable and practical, you want mechanism. And so I was super interested in that. And at the same time, I was super interested in action sports. obviously. We've been talking about it a lot. And if you know anything about action sports in the 1990s, you know that this is the so-called era of impossible, where more so-called impossible feats, things that had never been done and were never supposed to be done, got done. And they weren't just being done, they were being iterated upon, right? Surfing's a 1,000-year-old sport. And for 1,000 years, nobody ever surfs a wave over 25 feet tall. And there are physics papers written about how surfers can't paddle the waves over 25 feet tall. And suddenly, within a decade, we go from 25 feet up to, they're paddling into waves that are 70, 80, 90, and they're towing into 110, 115. And it's this is just surfing, it's skiing and snowboarding and rock climbing. So more importantly than like in one, the question was, well, what the hell is how is this possible? Why is this possible? What the hell's going on? And more important, I was living in Squaw Valley. I mean, these were my friends. This was my community. And I knew something about psychology and neuroscience. And I can tell you that like this group of people, most of the people I knew came from broken homes and really horrific childhoods. They had very little education. They had very little money. We were punk rockers, right? Like, there was a lot of risk taking. There was a lot of drug abuse. And normally you put that stuff together in a community, people go to jail or they die young. They don't reinvent what is possible for our species. So that was where this started. What the hell is going on? How is this possible? And at a certain point, when I started to decode that in action sports, I went, okay, that's cool. I want to see if it's true in other domains. So I went into business and science and technology. And, I covered science for the New York Times Sunday Magazine and Wired and about 11 other publications for 30 years. And my beat was those moments in time when sci-fi ideas became sci-fact technology, right? When somebody did the impossible and like turned it like bionics went from like the $6 million man when I was in high school and it was this neat idea, right? To like, this is like my friend Hugh Hare invents the world's first bionic ankle and now soldiers are returning to combat wearing them. You know what I mean? Like it's incredible. That's the impossible of dreaming up the future. That's that's bigger than 100-foot waves perhaps. Though I don't know. If you've ever been out in big surf, like like that. I don't know.
I've never surfed before. I'm scared of sharks. Like that's just shark soup. Especially out in Hawaii and California.
It's a totally ridiculously irrational fear, but that's all right.
I don't know, man. I've watched Shark Week multiple times. Those fuckers come out from the bottom and blast you.
I got to tell you, Justin, me and the other surfers in the world who believe that great waves are a precious resource. God bless Shark Week. Keep it up, guys. Keep it up. More horror films that scare people away from the waves. Absolutely. Keep going.
Keep the waters empty. That's that's so incredible though. Like that now you went from punk rock to now you're in this space and in the
beginning I started asking questions and writing articles and eventually those articles led to books. And eventually the people I was writing about started calling me with the questions. And I'd be like, why are you calling me? And they'd be like, well, you know more than anybody else. And then I was like, oh, okay, maybe we should all get together and try to study this stuff together, which is what the Flow Research Collective is, right? I work with 70 people and they're predominantly neuroscientists and psychologists. And, so.
You guys have the Avengers over there.
We do have the Avengers. Well, I built it for it to be the Avengers. Justin, you have to understand that I'm a hugely competitive person and I love being best in the world at things. And I will like flat out tell you that I want to be the best writer in the history of the universe. And I know that's not a real thing, but it doesn't change the fact that I really feel this way. And it's one of the reasons the athletes, I think, like me because they're like, oh, you're wired like us. You just like whatever it is, you want to be best. And I'm like, that's exactly right. So when I built the Flow Research Collective, I was like, okay, we're gonna work with the best, brightest people in the world on. The good news is there aren't that many people who are actually doing the neurobiology of peak human performance. It's not, it's not a huge group of people, and I wanted to bring together the best of the best to do this work.
What are the key differentiating factors that you see that people that succeed and excel at the highest level versus the people that try to do your type of mechanisms and they don't do as well?
So that's the new book, is The Art of Impossible. So as I said, look, when you talk about peak human performance, there you have a bunch of motivation skills. It's catch-all. Motivation means extrinsic motivation, money, sex, fame, things we'll work hard to get in the world. Intrinsic motivation. There are big five: curiosity, passion, purpose, autonomy, mastery, goals, grit. And there's a bunch of learning skills, creativity skills, and flow skills. Think about it this way. Motivation gets you into the game. Learning allows you to continue to play. Creativity is how you steer, especially when you're going for like high, hard, impossible goals where you're like, how the fuck am I going to get there? Right? Creativity is how you steer. And flow, optimal performance, is how you amplify the results. So the commonality among every peak performer, anyway, this is the biology. You don't go A to B without it. So Art of Impossible is a book about all these skills and how they work together because it's one system. Right. And if you get the system working the way it's been designed to work, you just go farther, faster with a lot less fuss. So the way I think about the new book, and when most people, I would get this, if you've read the book, this was your experience as well, when they read The Art of Impossible, if they're a peak performer, and I mean like top, if you're into this stuff, so you're applying something in your life, or you're in top 30, 40% of your field, you can't get there without this stuff because there's nothing else. There's just our biology, right? Like there's nothing else whiz bang on the outside. There's just this. And so when, the big deal, what's new, what's in The Art of Impossible that's not in all, the other books, because there are great books on grit and focus and intrinsic motivation and curiosity.
Hundreds of books.
Thousands of them out. And I've written some of them. I love a lot of them. And the point is, not that. The point is that we've figured out, it's a system. It's designed to work together. It's designed to work in a very specific order. It's all linked together. And there's a better way to do it. So it's not that you can't do it piecemeal. It's just that when you do it in the right way, you just go farther, faster. But that's what's new. That's what The Art of Impossible is. It's the big picture, which is new. So really, what's the defining characteristic of people? It's literally, that's kind of the whole of the book. I could point out a couple other things that I always like to say here. One of them is that I always say this: every successful person I've ever met is running from something just as fast as they're running towards something. Don't kid yourself, right? You want that double motivation. That's a good thing. Fear is.
I always feel like I'm behind.
Yeah. I'll always have a chip on my shoulder. I got beat up by the jocks when I was a kid. I'm still mad. Don't kid yourself.
We're very sorry to hear that.
That's all right.
What's weird is because I think it started when I was younger, because I wrestled and I played baseball for me. And I always felt like
you're the enemy.
Yeah. A very nice guy. I was friends with all kids in school. I knew everyone. I knew the goth kids. I knew the gangster kids. I knew the athletes. I knew the thespians, all of them. But for whatever reason, I don't know if this is genetic or whatever, but there's a lot of times that I saw people getting to things that I wanted to academically faster. So now those people, even in business now, me and my team, we've surpassed all of that. But for whatever reason, that doesn't go away. I still feel every day that people are beating me, and that drives me. And if I make $100 million and I have one of the biggest companies in the world, I'll still feel like that. And I don't think that will ever go away.
So you have to put it that you have to put by 50, adult development theory says if you want to enjoy the second half of your life, you got to come to terms with that by around 50. There's thresholds in adult development. So we know between your 20s and 30s, you have to sort of solve your identity crisis. Otherwise, you're not going to enjoy what happens next. By 40, you have to figure out, how do I make a living that in a way that aligns with your intrinsic motivators: curiosity, passion, purpose, autonomy, and mastery. Otherwise, it's very hard to enjoy what comes next. By 50, you have to have sort of forgiven those who have done you harm, in a sense. And that's how, I wrestle with this. I'm like, that chip got me pretty goddamn far. You know what I mean? I like that chip. So I'm trying to put down anything negative but I like my edge a little bit. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. If anyone's watched The Last Dance with Michael Jordan's a billionaire, best basketball player of all time.
The reason I always say small letter S spite, not capital letter S spite. Michael's what happens when you use capital S spite.
Yeah.
And right, it becomes it's a prison by the time in your later
Yes.
life. And I think he'd be the first to kind of admit that. And I think that's what that movie a little bit was about.
Yes.
Small s spite, right? Like I get great satisfaction out of proving people wrong. Trust me, I
Yeah.
had a 6th grade teacher who told me I wouldn't live to see 30. I sent her a postcard when I was 30.
Oh my.
Of
Oh
course,
wow.
I'm
That's
30.
awesome.
What now?
Never forget. Never. And guess
Yeah.
what? And guess what? I never forgot.
Yeah, I never forgot her. She changed my life. All right.
Oh man, yeah. I mean, I think those are good. It's good and bad, right? It depends on how you put them into your system, right? You can use it for great and have an extraordinary life and make a lot of difference in the world, or like you said, you could be a prison in your own mind.
You just got. I mean, but it works the same way. We were talking about spite, but like this is an art impossible also, and this is truly this is much worse, which is everybody who's ever had a passion or a purpose will sooner or later figure out that like it is very easy to turn your passion into a prison. And when you are living in a prison that is built out of your dreams, that's a really like I've had books. There's a couple books I've written where I've hated the entire experience, start to finish. It was just hard. I'm proud of the book. I'm glad I wrote it, but like it was just an awful experience, and it was awful for years, and there was nothing to be done about it. It was just that was what the book required. It was a difficult task, and that sort of thing. And the other thing I always want to point out when we talk about this also is that I've spent 20 years. One of the questions I like asking people a lot is, so tell me about the stuff that mattered, that happened to you. Like, what did you learn, or what event had the biggest impact on your performance? Meaning like you accomplished a goal and everything you did after that was different, right? And in 20 years of asking tens of thousands of people this question, nobody's ever said, oh, dude, there was this time I was walking through Grand Central and I looked down on the lotto ticket. You know what I mean? Like what they tell me is, no, there was this time I was in high school and my dad died and I had to raise my sister and her sister and take 3 jobs to pay my way through night school and medical school. And, now I'm Oprah's proctologist, So
yeah, absolutely.
right. And, but those are the stories those are the stories you hear. We are always defined by the hard stuff. We don't want we just think we want it easy. We don't actually want it easy. It's not rewarding.
No, and we get bored too. If anyone's ever wanted something, right? Like if you wanted a nice car or you wanted to live in a nice place, right? Whether you've done it or not, most people that have done it, they wanted it, and then it's cool for a couple of weeks, and then it's like, okay, what's next?
Well, I will tell you, I will speak to that in a sense, because I think I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting things.
Yes.
I want a nice house. I want a nice, but understand so I built my dream house. I've been designing my dream house since I was 4 years old. It took me a very long time to like get there and do it. And once it was done, it was done. I don't like this was about a very specific thing. And okay, I can yes, there's another goal. You always want another goal, but you can't make if the hedonic treadmill, if the materialistic treadmill is your those are your goals. First of all, that's not a fire, that it's not sustaining. It doesn't it won't ultimately last very long. It's there's extrinsic motivation is good, but it's only going to get you so far.
Right. I want to touch on your prior stuff real fast, and then we can really dive into the newest book. What were some of the things that you wrote in your past? Because you're a very credible, high level author. Your books are bestsellers on all different platforms. What was some of the things that when you look at your past work, you say, damn, I was completely wrong, or I fucked this up. This is not right. Or you're like, man, come on, Stephen, why did I write that? Is there anything at all that you wish you could go back and change?
There's nothing I won't change anything, but I mean, there, in Abundance, Peter and I opened Abundance in the city of Masdar, which is supposed to be the city of the future. It doesn't even exist anymore. That project got canceled. So we often think about that one. We're like, well, we were right about almost everything else in the book, but does it have to be like the first thing in the damn book that we were wrong about? Both of us were, Peter more than me because he was the bigger advocate, but I will fall on this sword too. We were wrong about the timetable around biofuel development. when we were writing on technology. For sure, there's been a bunch of those. There was I've made certain mistakes as a reporter. You're going to get, there's certain facts you got wrong where you're just like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And you owe apologies and you really screwed up. And like, I had a really long career as a writer and a reporter and a researcher. And you're like, of course you're going to make errors. You just like, doesn't matter how rigorous you try to be, errors are going to creep in. And so, yeah, I mean, those are, I always say that the experience of writing a book is the experience of essentially failing every day, right? Because you write it and you think it's great. You come back the next day and you're like, oh, it's crap. It just sucks. And let me just fix this. And the next day it's the same experience. The only time the book is done is when I send it to the publisher and say, okay, don't let me edit it again. And the minute I'm going to go back and read it, like I like Rise of Superman the best because I can get to about page 34 or 35 before I get overwhelmed by the errors and my shitty writing and how much I hate myself and how small life. You know what I mean? Like, of course,
it's a good book. It's a very good book.
I love it. No, I love it. It's one of my favorite books that I've written.
I'm a huge nerd too, because once I saw, that was the first book I saw from you. Once I saw Superman, I was sold. I didn't even know who Stephen Kotler was. I just said I saw the Rise of Superman. I was like, done. Bought it. Excellent. Barnes and Nobles. Take my money. Yeah, no, your work is great, man. I'm always curious to ask, like, if you could go back in time, what would you change, or what would you tell your younger self?
I don't have any of that stuff, really, honest to God, because I love who I am and I love what my life is, and I don't get to be me without all the mess ups and screw ups and victories. But like, you know what I mean? And I can't do that. So I don't often play that. I don't think that way.
You don't want to be Doctor Strange and start changing time.
I'm happy with who I am. And like who I am took a lot of mistakes to get to.
Right. Do you think that's the only way? Or do you think that you can actually put out a plan, someone follows it, someone that's very good at, taking on tasks, following directions?
So Justin, you have to understand, I'm a long-term thinker. I tend to routinely, a very common question for me is to ask myself, well, in 5 years from now, if I had this skill, what would be different? And I'll routinely, work on. Yeah, I have no, I've got no problem with 20 to 10, 20, 30-year projects sometimes. Like some of my books have taken that long. I'm interested in the process. I'm interested in how do you do it every day? But I don't mind extremely long time horizons, and I've been extremely strategic. Because some of this stuff, for me to be able to do the work I'm doing at the Flow Research Collective, I had to first convince most of the world that flow was a thing and that there was science underneath it and a lot of work that had been done by a lot of researchers, not just a guy named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. I was a brilliant genius, but he's a psychologist, and there's like hundreds of other people, thousands at this point, who've worked on flow. It's a thick, big field that I had to introduce to the world. And that, like, just moving it from this idea into something. My West of Jesus was written in 2006. The Flow Research Collective wasn't founded until 2018. It took a very that's a 12-year business plan essentially.
Right. So you don't have like a Stephen Kotler starter pack to get to the optimal level.
I have a book called The Art of Impossible that is like, it's 30 years of this research that's been turned to a peak performance primer. So that's the playbook. If you want the playbook, and people ask, what do you do? It's there. Literally, you get to the end of the book, there's 6 things to do every day, 7 things to do every week. That's what I do.
That's awesome. What were some of the biggest things in the gap of Stealing Fire and The Art of Impossible that you had a realization that in The Art of Impossible you put in that you didn't realize when you were doing Stealing Fire?
So I think they're like 3 or 4 books between those books. Also.
Right.
There was a lot of stuff. Stealing Fire is my least favorite book. I know it's everybody else's favorite book. It's my least favorite book.
Really?
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of psychedelic culture in general. So like while we talked a lot about psychedelic culture and Burning Man culture and things like that, because that was part of that's not I'm not particularly interested in it. I don't
Wow. Why do you think that caught on so well over the other ones?
Because it was a book about a revolution in how we approach problem solving and it was, psychedelics were part of it, meditation, a whole bunch of other stuff was part of it. I think,
Right.
it's just that book has become a talisman in the psychedelic community, and that's great. And it's not a drug thing. I'm a big fan of drugs. I think it's fine if you want a little vacation from life, have a little vacation from life. I am like the fact that there's a whole bunch of people running around having mystical shamanic experiences and here's my shaman and let's have a ritual and shut the fuck up.
Man.
You're doing drugs in the jungle. Like just
Yes.
shut up. You're doing drugs. Cool drugs are fine, but don't guss it up with fancy language and tell me about oneness with I could explain the neurobiology, please God, because the amount of the ego consciousness that comes with that, that
Right.
whole bra psychedelic culture right now makes me sick. I just think it's a bunch of idiots. Can't stand it.
Oh, don't share your thoughts with us. I mean, I've never done psychedelics, but you did touch on those a lot. And a lot of people, especially in Silicon Valley, they touch on, getting into flow states with psychedelics and psilocybin microdosing and all these things. But it's funny that that's your least favorite book.
Well,
but it's
I got to go in a couple of minutes, Justin, but let me leave you with this, because this is how I think about it. At the Flow Research Collective, we only train people in psychological and physiological interventions. And the reason is really simple. It's not that psychedelics and technological stuff doesn't work and you can't play with it. It's that when I'm dramatic, I'm like, back when I was a journalist, I was shot at on 5 separate occasions. At no point when somebody was shooting at me could I be like, excuse me, sir, would you put down that AK-47 while I microdose this substance so I could dodge your bullets in 20 minutes, right? That's just not how life works. And when the boss says, hey, Justin, get in here. I need that presentation. We were going to do it next Friday. I need it now. I need it for my boss. I need it for her boss. And your job depends on it, right? There's no time for a technology. There's no time for a substance. There's what's going to work right here, right now, reliable, repeatable every time that I can totally depend on, because now my job is on the line. Or the much more common experience that we all have all the time when your significant other says, hey, honey, can you come in here so we can talk about something? Right? You're like, oh shit. Okay. What do I do?
Shit.
What do I do? Right? There's no time for it. You got to perform at your best then and there. So that's one of the things. I just think I'm not saying the other modalities are bad and ineffective, and sometimes they're very useful in helping people steer, but I am interested in the neurobiology of flow. That's all I've ever been interested in. And even though it bumps up against these other things, I find those other things culturally interesting, and they're sort of important in the context of flow. My work is about the neurobiology of flow, and I find it most effective to work that way. So drugs are fine for a little bit of a vacation, but if you're and if you're interested in flow, you're going to have more luck. The research is really clear with marijuana than you are with any other substance. So if you're actually even trying, if you want to play this game with flow, most of the psychedelics are serotonin-based compounds, and serotonin has less and less to do with flow, and it's at the tail end of the experience, a little bit at the beginning, and very little in the middle. As far as we can tell, that might be a little bit off, but an anandamide sits dead smack in the middle of the whole experience. So even if you're interested in biohacking flow and you want to go for substances, psychedelics are the wrong compounds based on what we know.
Well, if you guys want all the answers on how to do it, get the book, The Art of Impossible. It's out now. It's sold everywhere, right? Barnes and Noble.
Everywhere. Amazon is your friend, but support your local independent. COVID was hard on indie bookstores, so go support your local independents if you can.
Absolutely. And what's the best way for people to reach out to you? They want to learn more about your work.
flowresearchcollective.com is anything you want to know about flow and the work we do, the trainings we do. For your listeners, if you go to flowblocker.com, that's a diagnostic. There are 6 major flow blockers. So we built a free diagnostic. It'll say, okay, this is the biggest thing standing between you and more flow, and it'll give you a bunch of action steps. And it's pretty thick on the back end. It's a real gift. It's a real thing. People have found it really useful. So that's there, stephenkotler.com. And what did we learn today? Don't use fire hydrants to brake on rollerblades or sides of bridges. Sides of bridges, fire hydrants, No good.
If you're going down, don't grab. You got to commit, or you're gonna fall. It's black or white. It's yes or no. Guys, all this will be in the show notes. Steven, I appreciate your time.
Justin,
And
thank you.
Everyone, if they want to get all of Steven's work, it's real easy to find him. It will be in the show notes, and I appreciate your time. And this is the Justin Caviar Show, and we are out.
Peace.